Well, let's talk about remake versus remaster. And I think that this is a really fun. It's fun to talk about, and I think that I had understood in my mind what a remake and a remaster was, but then as things go on, it obviously gets muddled. And they are just terms, and they don't really have to have a set definition. But I've always thought of a remaster as, like you said, is it the original game, but it just looks better? And sometimes you can do that if you put a PS3 game. Let's look at Shadow of the Colossus. Remastering that on the PS3, it's the same basic game. I'm assuming like everything under the hood is the same. It just runs better. It's not going to be a clunky, 15 frames per second. It can run at a solid 30 or 60, and it's going to look better. Now, to confuse that, on PS4, Shadow of the Colossus Remaster is still, everything is exactly the same. They just really upgraded it. Now, do they just kind of slap new visuals on the same core game underneath, or do they redo that? Like, when does that become a remake?
Yeah, I mean, it's when you have to swap out something like the engine. I don't know. I kept thinking about things like Yakuza and Yakuza Kiwami, because they call it a remaster or a remake, and when you look back at it, to me it just looks, it's like a lot of quality of life changes and some really impressive visuals, but ultimately it's the exact same game, just like in the case of Shadow of Colossus.
So when I hear the term remaster, I think that should hold true to it being the exact same game, but either you've taken the original, like in the case of a PS2 game, to a PS3, or if there's sort of one generation difference, I think you can take basically the same game and you can just upgrade the visuals. Last of Us remastered on PS4, but when there's more of a difference, even though it's still one generation, when they did the first Super Mario All-Stars, those games were pretty much exactly the same. Everything was in the same spot, Mario 1, 2, 3, but they were completely overhauled with new visuals. And I mean, I don't know the coding. I don't know if the same game is running underneath. The same thing with the Shadow Colossus on PS4, but it looks completely different. And that's more of I don't think there's much they could do to improve it. But I would say that if I'm going to advertise this as a remaster, and this has me thinking from Final Fantasy VII Remake, what are you selling me? If I hear remaster, I think it should be exactly the same game. And then remake is when it tends to become more blurred. Like the Yakuza Kiwami, it's definitely totally new visuals, but it's, like you said, it's completely faithful to that original experience.
Exactly.
So then you got something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where I guess the name is in the title of what they did. To me, that's more like a reboot, because you're using some of the same characters, or I don't know, a soft reboot or whatever it is. To me, that felt like if I went into that thinking I was going to get a Yakuza Kiwami, but it was a Final Fantasy VII Kiwami, it's not. It's this whole other. It's basically a brand new imagining of that world and that game. And there are some things that are note for note copied, but that's not what the game is all about.
Yeah, I like the idea that in some cases a remake is taking the game and just making it go along an entirely different axis from whatever the original was. It's like one of the things I was thinking of was Link's Awakening, and this is a little bit more of a simple remake in the way they did it, but it's going from 2D when it was originally released on Game Boy to 3D, and they're also changing the entire look of it through like that sort of tilt shift lens effect, so it kind of has like that toy-like appearance, and it makes it feel like an entirely different game, but it's still pretty much the same thing, but the appearance is just so radically different.
Absolutely. That's probably one of the best versions of a remaster remake. I mean, I guess you would call that a remake because everything is brand new there, but the core experience, and most things are probably all in the same spot. The core experience of what it is to play that game is the same. It's almost, I think for me, like a good remaster should feel like this is how I remembered the game, and this is how I would like to experience the game now, where something like Final Fantasy VII Remake has made me feel like I don't like the idea of you remaking a game. If you want to do your own thing, then do your own thing. Like, get your own property. And I mean, that game I take kind of personally, and I didn't have a great experience with that, with the remake, because I was expecting it to be like the Link's Awakening remaster, where it was, yeah, that's a remake, but to me it just feels like a really super polished remaster, where they did bring in new visual elements, but the game is still there. They don't pull a bait and switch on what the game is going to be.
Or maybe even the Kiwami remake, since that's kind of, that's like, if you look, I was actually looking this a little bit before we were recording, but the side-by-side comparisons of the PS2 graphics versus PS4 for Kiwami and Kiwami 2, and it's just, it's so different, like, you know, as you would expect. And it's kind of like what I would have thought had I been looking forward to Final Fantasy VII and having played it in the past and then wanting to play the remake. I would have kind of been anticipating something along those lines as well.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I think people, like I said, with the memory, when you imagine back to those older games, it's you, because at the time when Yakuza came out on the PS2, it was probably pretty cutting edge. It probably felt very realistic. So in your mind's eye, in your memory of it, you feel like you played this very realistic crime drama, and now you're just updating that realism. Whereas, I mean, when I went back to play Final Fantasy VII, the PlayStation 4 port, so I played that in like 2015 or 2016, I was actually really shocked, because I hadn't played the game since the 90s, that the most of the images for the characters, the models, they look like Lego characters. They don't really, they just kind of had these like blockheads with incredibly, I mean, they were like stick figure faces of just a drawn smile and a little bit of detail in the eyes. And I had remembered them a lot different, probably because there's like the cutscene version of them and there's the Battlefield version of them. So I was just hoping to have an update, keep the game the same, because that is a big part of the game experience, is can be playing it the way it was originally meant to be played. You know, when I think of playing Final Fantasy VII now, I enjoy that it was a crazy mix of FMV, the CGI, and pre-rendered backgrounds, which I was happy that they put some pre-rendered backgrounds in 7 Remake, but it was just like a completely different vision of it.
I was kind of just thinking a little bit earlier, and while you were talking, you know, I wonder if there's a good litmus test that you can use while you're playing to determine, you know, am I playing a remake or am I playing a remaster? And I was thinking of like that button that they have in Halo 2.
Yeah.
The one for the Master Chief Collection, where you can flash back to the old graphics and the new graphics. If you can add a button like that in the game to be able to do that, I feel like you're probably playing a remaster, perhaps.